You haven't even earned your name, you washerwoman, Bruno said with a chuckle, leaning back on the leather couch surrounded by his friends. Why don't you stay where you belong and not try to meddle where you'll never be? She's just a cleaning lady. Bruno leaned meekly on the railing, watching the girl who was sweeping the terrace outside their country house. His voice was half chilling, half contemptuous, and the few friends who sat nearby cackled in unison. In their company she represented nothing but an amusement, an object of ridicule, an exquisite toy for the majors, in whose world those who were not born with a golden spoon in their mouths were invisible.
Thank you for watching my channel. I create videos for your enjoyment. Please subscribe if you want to support my efforts, it's very important to me. I apologize in advance for any mistakes. Dubbing is done by neural network. Please point out mistakes in the comments so I can correct them.
But what Bruno could not have foreseen was that this game would one day turn his life upside down. He was sure that people like her should thank fate for the right to be in their elite circles, albeit as a servant. He'd never imagined that a girl with such a quiet, barely noticeable presence could one day become his obsession. He was used to the world revolving around him, and those words, accompanied by scornful glances, were the norm for him. Hannah, leaning over the mop, could barely hold back her tears, not because of his words, but because at that moment she finally realized that people like Bruno didn't know what real feelings were. And she hadn't yet realized how this smug major would soon be at her mercy, but not in the way he was used to. Bruno grew up in a family with endless opportunities. His stepfather, the owner of a large real estate business, provided him with everything. Expensive cars, education at the best universities, luxurious parties where you could humiliate people for fun. Bruno lived in his own world, where money ruled everything, and people working for him were just a background for his pleasures. Hannah, on the other hand, found herself in this country house in a completely different way. A young girl from the provinces, she worked here as a cleaner not because she couldn't find a better place, but because she needed money to support her online studies and start her own business. While working as a cleaner, she learned all the laws of the business world, web design and marketing, which allowed her to earn money online in parallel. Bruno didn't know this, however, and Hannah never bragged about it. Every day she watched in silence as Bruno and his friends, perpetually rowdy, treated everything and everyone who wasn't on their level with disdain. They would gather at the country house on weekends, spending their time in endless parties and discussing their accomplishments. At one such gathering, Hannah happened to overhear Bruno and his friends talking about her. "Did you see the way she looked at me?" he said, laughing. "Typical poor girl, thinking that if she's pretty she has any chance at all." His words hit Hannah but didn't break her. She knew her own worth and realized that in his world, being a floorwalker meant being a nobody. But for her it was temporary. Every night when she returned to her small room in the same house, she sat down at her laptop and worked. Her dream was to get out of here, to prove she was capable of more than just maintaining his house. Her name was Hannah, a slim figure in a gray work coat, long blonde hair braided into a modest braid, and a slightly stubborn look that she cast over her shoulder at Bruno's group of friends. Hannah tried to remain inconspicuous, but every step she took, every movement gave away something more about her. She wasn't broken or submissive, no matter how much Bruno and his buddies tried to humiliate her. On the contrary, there was a defiance in her silent gaze that was angry on the surface, ready to burst out. For months Bruno continued to humiliate Hannah, noticing how she reacted with restraint to his words. He was used to people breaking under his pressure, but Hannah was different. She always carried out her duties with cold calmness, never giving in to provocation. At some point, Bruno began to notice his irritation growing into something else. Why doesn't she break down? Why doesn't she cry? He pondered one evening, watching her from his bedroom window. There was a grace in her movements and a cold determination in her eyes that he could never break. One day Bruno noticed Hannah working on her laptop late at night when he happened to pass by her room. His curiosity took over and he stepped closer. She was typing something with passion, not noticing him at all. Bruno looked at her as he had never looked at any girl before. At that moment he realized that his view of her had changed. He began to feel a strange attraction to her. It was unusual and incomprehensible to him. He, a major who could get any girl he wanted, began to feel that Hannah was more than just a floorwalker, as he called her. She was different, strong and independent, which drew him in. But despite these feelings, he couldn't change right away. Bruno still tried to maintain before his friends the image of a cold and arrogant man, continuing to humiliate her at every opportunity. Every morning at the country house started the same way. Hannah came early, while the owners were still asleep, and tidied up the endless halls, rooms, and terraces. She had time to do a lot in a day. She cleaned the floors, washed the windows, took out the garbage, set the tables for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Her work was hard and low profile, but that's what she liked. Staying in the shadows. Until they came along, Bruno and his friends. The day he'd first noticed her, Hannah had just finished cleaning the living room. Bruno's group of friends bustled in, not noticing her presence as if she wasn't even there. It was an everyday occurrence. She was used to being invisible. But when she heard the taunts, she felt something boil in her chest. "Hey Hannah," Bruno said lazily, as if playing with her like a cat and mouse. "Do you think your job matters? Or that you mean anything at all here?" Hannah slowly raised her head, her eyes meeting his. She knew it was best to keep quiet, that answering him would be adding fuel to the fire, but she couldn't help herself. "I work to earn money," she said quietly, but her voice sounded clear and firm. "And you're just having fun, not knowing the real life." Bruno raised his eyebrows, surprised that she dared to answer. His friends froze for a moment, then laughed loudly. "What philosophy?" one of his friends said mockingly. "You're just scrubbing floors, Hannah. What kind of real life is that?" That was the beginning. From that day on, Bruno and his friends found new ways to humiliate Hannah. They would deliberately spill water all over the floor and make her clean it all over again, or they would spill garbage on purpose. But Hannah never once broke down, never once gave any sign that the bullying was hurting her. Despite the constant bullying, Hannah never allowed herself to let up. Every day she continued to do her job with dignity, even when she was forced to pick up trash with jeers in the background, even when the jokes became increasingly cruel. She was calm on the outside, but inside a storm raged. Her thoughts were filled with hundreds of answers, hundreds of words she wanted to throw in Bruno's face, but held back. For now. Bruno, however, was beginning to notice her. Noticing the way her eyes burned with fire when she didn't give in to his humiliation. He was used to seeing only those around him who obediently looked him in the mouth, who feared or admired him, but Hannah was different. She was a challenge he couldn't understand, and it was beginning to weigh on him. It amazed him that this quiet girl, seemingly with no money or connections behind her, continued to be unwavering. Unlike other people, she was not afraid of him, nor did she admire his wealth and power. At first it made him angry, and then it began to intrigue him. He began to watch her. He stayed on the terrace longer when she was working, sometimes even coming early to catch her cleaning. Each day he realized more and more that Hannah wasn't as simple as he thought. There was a confidence in her movements and a depth in her eyes that made him wonder. Bruno himself didn't notice how his attitude towards Hannah began to change. At first he had thought of her as a mere plaything, something temporary and insignificant. But day after day, as he watched her hold back her anger and continue to work without provocation, he suddenly began to see her as more than that. This wasn't just a cleaning lady in a gray work coat who silently cleaned up after him and his friends. Hannah was something he had been searching for a long time, but couldn't quite figure out what it was. Bruno had always lived in a world where everything was a snap of the fingers. If he wanted a car, he bought the most expensive one. If he wanted clothes, he paid for the brand without thinking about the price. The people in his life came and went in the same pattern. Girls who were with him for his status, friends who supported him while he paid for their parties. But here came Hannah, and she didn't fit into any of those categories. On one such day, while watching her work, he realized that he'd been just staring at her for several minutes now, forgetting that she was supposed to be invisible to him. Her slender, graceful fingers carefully dusted the shelves, her long lashes drooping slightly as she tried to concentrate on her work. But it was her eyes that struck him most of all. There was a challenge in them, but also a power he couldn't ignore. And that's when he began to be drawn to her. Bruno tried to justify it to himself as just another game. An interest in the inaccessible, he thought. But even his friends had noticed that he wasn't as active in teasing Hannah lately. He'd become more thoughtful, quieter. "Are you in love with your cleaning lady?" Adam, one of his friends, had once asked him during a party. Nonsense, Bruno had thrown shortly, hiding his irritation. But inside he felt that Adam's joke had hit right on the mark. The more Bruno thought about Hannah, the angrier he felt at himself. It was an unfamiliar feeling. How could he allow himself to think about a girl who was so far below him in status? He, the representative of the golden youth, the son of a rich businessman, was supposed to choose among the best girls in London, not think about some cleaning lady. But every time he saw her calm, proud, undignified, he couldn't shake off that inner tension. Hannah had become his inner struggle. His mind resisted the feeling, unwilling to recognize that there was more to her simplicity and modesty. But his heart, against all odds, began to reach for her. Meanwhile, Hannah was unaware of the thoughts that were tearing him up inside. She continued to do her job, even though every day she faced humiliation and ridicule. But a certainty was growing inside her. One day she would leave. She had no intention of staying in this house any longer than she had to. All she cared about now was her own goals. She had long ago started developing an online business, working evenings after cleaning. Day by day her income grew, and Vika was getting closer to her dream of becoming independent with every step. It took Bruno a long time to decide to approach Hannah and start a conversation. He realized that she despised him for the way he and his friends treated her. But one day the situation changed. It was another evening when he and his friends were going to a party at the country house. Hannah was just putting away the glasses after the company had been partying on the terrace. Bruno stepped closer to her, feeling the tension building up inside. "Hannah," he said her name in surprise. She froze without turning around, continuing to clear the table. Her silence was more eloquent than any words. "I want to apologize," he said, though he struggled with each word. It was unusual for him. Bruno had never apologized, especially to people he considered inferior. Hannah turned slowly, her gaze as cold as ice. "For what?" she asked, squinting her eyes. There was no warmth in her voice. "For the way we treated you." Bruno didn't know what to say next. He felt that this apology sounded too empty and useless. Hannah only grinned. "You have nothing to apologize for. You live in your own world where people like me mean nothing. You don't understand what it's like to be in my shoes." Bruno felt his lips trembling slightly. He didn't know what to say in response, and it pissed him off even more. She was right. After Hannah had left, leaving Bruno standing in the middle of the room, a feeling of emptiness overtook him. She had spoken to him as if they had never had anything in common, as if they lived in parallel universes. And that, in fact, was true. She showed him his own insignificance, his superficiality, his futile attempts to apologize for the years of humiliation he himself had created. From that moment Bruno began to change. He no longer saw the point in his usual amusements. The idle parties, the expensive purchases, the fleeting flings, all lost their significance. He began to spend more time alone, thinking about what his world looked like before he met Hannah and how things had changed now. He often thought about her words. "You don't understand what it's like to be in my shoes." Those words were a real challenge to him. He had always prided himself on getting his way easily, but with Hannah it was different. She didn't fit into the patterns he was used to. She wasn't the type to give in to money or status. One day Bruno took a bold step. He decided to have a night out without friends, without drinking, without all the things that usually filled his time. He wanted to spend that evening at the house where Hannah lived and talk to her honestly like he had never talked to her before. It was important to him that she realize he had changed. Bruno couldn't let her go without saying the most important thing. When Hannah entered the house that evening, she didn't expect to see Bruno alone. Usually there was noise, laughter, and loud music in the house, but this time it was quiet. He was sitting in the hall, and when he saw her, he stood up as if he had been waiting for this moment. "We need to talk," he said as she tried to walk around him in silence. Hannah squinted skeptically, clearly not believing he could say anything really important. "We found her," he said, handing Bruno his notes. "She lives in London near the center. She rents a small apartment, works online. Looks like she's doing internet sales." Bruno listened intently, trying not to miss a word. Many questions were swirling around in his head. How did she get on in life? Why did she leave without explanation? Is she happy? Thank you, he replied briefly to the detective and taking the papers headed home. This information awakened a new feeling in him. He knew that now that he had found her, he had to act. He couldn't just leave it at that. He didn't know how Hannah would react to him coming into her life, but he was willing to take the risk. Bruno thought long and hard about how to approach Hannah. He didn't want to show up at her door out of the blue, but he didn't see any other options. He drove up to her house several times, but each time something stopped him. He was afraid of her reaction, afraid of seeing contempt in her eyes, or worse, complete indifference. One day he made up his mind. He rang the doorbell of her apartment, and a few seconds later it opened. Bruno? Hannah was surprised to see him on the doorstep. She obviously hadn't expected to see him again. Hannah, I couldn't just disappear. He began, trying to find the right words. I was looking for you. Looking for me? She raised her eyebrows in surprise. Why? He looked her straight in the eyes, feeling something turn inside. It was hard for him to speak, but he knew he couldn't hold it in any longer. I can't forget you, he said quietly. Ever since you left, I think about you all the time. I've tried to live like I used to, but it's impossible. You've changed me. Hannah fell silent. She hadn't expected such words from the man who had once been the symbol of all humiliation and pain for her. She stared at him, trying to understand what was going on. She wasn't easily moved by words, but deep down she felt that his words were sincere. Hannah was silent for a long time before answering. Her feelings were mixed. She felt annoyed at Bruno for intruding into her life again, but somewhere deep inside she felt a slight shiver at his confession. Her heart beat faster, but her mind was cold and rational. Bruno, I don't know what you expect me to say, she said at last, looking him straight in the eye. I can't forget the way you treated me before. I understand, he said quietly. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I've changed. She rolled her eyes, not hiding her irony. You've changed? Really? Bruno, people don't change that fast. And even if you have changed, what does it change for you? Bruno clenched his jaws upon hearing her answer, but he didn't back down. I realize you may not believe me, Hannah, he continued, trying to remain calm even though a storm was raging inside. But ever since you left, I've realized how much it meant to me to have you by my side. You're strong, you're smart, you're beautiful. You're different. You're not like any girl I've ever met before. And I'm a fool for realizing it too late. Hannah crossed her arms over her chest, keeping her cold gaze on him. You always saw me as nothing more than a washerwoman, she said. You enjoyed humiliating me in front of my friends, making me a laughingstock. And now that I'm no longer dependent on you, you suddenly think I deserve better? That you've realized your mistakes? That's ridiculous, Bruno. Bruno lowered his gaze. Her words cut him like a knife, but he knew he deserved it. He couldn't expect things to change in an instant. I'm not asking you to forgive me right away, he said quietly. I just want you to give me a chance to prove that I can be different, that I can be a man worthy of your respect. Hannah stared at him for a long moment, as if pondering his words. Her inner conflict was evident. On the one hand, she couldn't forget the humiliation she had gone through. On the other hand, she saw that in front of her was no longer the self-righteous and arrogant major she had known before. In front of her was a man who was truly sorry for his actions. Do you want to prove that you have changed? She asked defiantly. All right, prove it. But I'm not going to wait for you to do it. I'm living my life and you're not a part of it. I understand, Bruno replied quietly. But I'll be there for you if you let me. Hannah didn't answer. She turned and closed the door behind her, leaving him standing alone. But this time Bruno didn't feel despair. For the first time in a long time he had hope. Everything depended on him now. After that meeting with Hannah, Bruno realized that his life would never be the same again. He could no longer return to a carefree existence, to endless parties and ostentatious luxury. He realized that the values he had lived by before were empty. Bruno began to change his life. He took his work with his stepfather seriously, trying not just to be the heir to the business, but to bring something of his own to it. He became interested in real estate, personally attended meetings with partners and began to study the market, trying to become self-sufficient and independent. But most importantly, he began to work on himself. Bruno went to a psychologist to sort out his internal contradictions and understand what led him to the mistakes he had made with Hannah. This process was hard and painful, but he realized that it was necessary if he wanted to really change. Along with that, he made an effort to stay in Hannah's life. He didn't impose himself, but he wrote to her regularly, inquiring about her affairs, offering help. Hannah responded dryly, but didn't push him away completely. She saw his efforts, but still doubted his sincerity. While Bruno was trying to turn his life around, Hannah wasn't standing still either. She was developing her online business, which was starting to make her some good money. She felt her life becoming more independent, free from the past in which she was only a hollowed-out woman. In the back of her mind, however, her thoughts still returned to Bruno. Despite everything he had done, Hannah couldn't ignore the changes she saw in him. He had truly become different, more considerate, more human. But she feared it was temporary, that he was just playing a role to win her back. Her fears and doubts kept her busy. She tried to focus on work, but every time she got a text from him or saw him outside her house, something inside her responded. Hannah didn't know if she could trust again the man who had once betrayed her trust. One day, a few months after their last meeting, Bruno showed up at her door again. This time he looked serious and collected, his eyes glowing with determination. "Hannah, I need to talk to you," he said when she opened the door. She gave him a wary look, but let him in. Bruno began to talk about what he had been through in the last few months. His work on himself, how his life had changed, how he had realized that he had been living wrong. Bruno told everything unvarnished, honestly, without trying to hide his weaknesses or his previous mistakes. He admitted that he used to think he was better than others, that he used to humiliate people for fun, and that he took his privileged life for granted. But now, after he'd lost Hannah, he realized that those things didn't bring him any happiness. "You were the only one who saw me for who I really was," he said, clenching his hands into fists. "You didn't try to please me like the others. You weren't afraid to speak your mind. And you were right, Hannah. You saw that I was empty and spoiled. But now I want to change that. I want to be worthy of you." Hannah listened to him in silence. She noticed that there was no longer the former arrogance in his voice. There was a sincerity in it now that she had never heard before. It confused her, but she couldn't immediately believe that this change was permanent. "Why are you doing this, Bruno?" she finally asked, trying to remain calm. "Why are you trying so hard to get me back?" He lowered his gaze and with a sigh answered, "Because I love you, Hannah. And it's not just a crush. I've thought about it for a long time and I know it's real feelings. I'm willing to wait as long as it takes for you to realize that and maybe give me a chance. I want nothing more than to prove that I can be worthy of your love." Her heart froze for a moment. Bruno's words caught her off guard. Love? Could the guy who had once made fun of her really have such feelings? Hannah was confused, her mind fighting back. But her heart couldn't ignore the warmth that spilled inside when he spoke such words. "Love?" she asked incredulously. "You call that love? After all this time?" "Yes," he answered quietly but firmly. "It's more than guilt or regret. I know what it is. I love you and I'm ready to prove it, if you give me the chance." It took Hannah a long time to recover from that meeting. Bruno's words rattled around in her head, keeping her awake. Her past with him had been too complicated, too painful, for her to simply forget everything that had happened between them. And yet, despite that, she could see that he had changed. One day she decided to seek advice from her friend Gina. They met in a cafe and Hannah told her everything that had happened in the last few months. Gina listened attentively, sometimes nodding her head, but not interrupting. "Listen, Hannah," Gina finally said when Hannah stopped talking. "I don't want to pry into your life, but I'll tell you one thing. People rarely change. Especially people like Bruno. But if you really see a change in him, maybe you should give him a chance. But don't be in a hurry. Let him prove his words by his actions." Hannah thought about her friend's words. She knew Gina was right. Bruno had to prove his love not with words but with actions. And she decided that she would no longer hide from her feelings. She allowed herself to be open to what might happen, but she remained cautious. Bruno began slowly, step by step, to prove his sincerity. He didn't insist on meetings, he didn't pressure her. He began to take care of his business, continuing to work on himself and his stepfather's business. Occasionally he would write to her, asking how she was doing, but he left the space Hannah needed. A few months passed and Hannah began to notice that her attitude towards Bruno was changing. She still kept her distance, but she could see that he was no longer the narcissistic major he used to be. He had indeed changed. But the question was whether that change was enough for her to trust him again. One day, when Bruno invited her to dinner as a thank you for listening to him back then, she agreed. They met in a small cozy restaurant in central London. Hannah expected to see a nervous and tense Bruno, but he was calm, respectful, and importantly, he was no longer trying to impress with his wealth. They talked about life, about plans, and for the first time in a long time Vika felt a new connection between them. As the evening drew to a close, Bruno offered to drive her home, but Hannah declined, preferring to go for a walk. She didn't want to rush things, but she felt something change in her heart. Bruno had become more than just the guy who had once humiliated her. He became a man who was willing to fight for her trust and love. A few more months passed. Hannah continued to grow her business, becoming more and more independent and successful. Bruno, in turn, took over the family's affairs, introducing new ideas into the business that gradually brought results. But most importantly, a new history began to emerge between them. Hannah opened up to Bruno more and more, although she remained cautious. She saw his efforts and sincerity, but she didn't want to rush things. Her heart remembered the pain he had caused her, but it also reached for the man he had become. One evening as they sat in a cafe and chatted about small things, Hannah suddenly realized that she was no longer afraid to be around Bruno. He had become important to her, someone she could rely on despite her past.